Good afternoon, everyone. I am Alexandra Whitaker. I will be moderating this session. We are grateful to have you both in person as well as those who are participating via the web. I wanted to introduce myself first. I am currently the Chief Trade Counsel for the Ways and Means Committee with the U.S. House of Representatives. We have jurisdiction over trade. I am joined by two distinguished thought experts when it comes to trade, Lori Wallach and Dan Eikenson. I'll introduce them in more details shortly. I wanted to start with a couple of housekeeping matters. Those of you who are seeking CLE credit, if you haven't, please identify one of the ASIL representatives before the program begins. You'll have to do it again at the end in order to get CLE credit. For those who are participating virtually, you'll be contacted after the annual meeting to submit a self-certification form. As a reminder for participation, we are accepting questions through the app, so if you want to ask a question, please submit it through the app and I will pose the question to the panelists. Okay, and with that, let's introduce our distinguished panelists. Let's start with Lori Wallach. She is the director of Rethink Trade Program at the American Economic Liberties Project. She's a 30-year veteran of trade debates, starting with the 1990 fights over the North American and Free Trade Agreement, the NAFTA, as well as the WTO. She was named to Politico's 50 list of thinkers, doers, and visionaries, transforming American politics for her leadership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership debate. So she is well-versed in all of the thorny issues of trade. She is internationally recognized expert on trade law and policy, with experience advocating in Congress and foreign parliaments, trade negotiations, courts, and government agencies. She has testified on NAFTA, the WTO, China trade, and other globalization issues before 30 congressional committees, and appeared on a host of news outlets, and both domestic and foreign. She is a lawyer by training and will bring an interesting perspective to the debate today. Next, I'll turn to Dan Eikenson. He is an economist and a renowned international trade expert who has spent over 30 years analyzing, communicating, and influencing the formulation of U.S. and global trade policy. Dan joins us from NDP Analytics after 9 years as director of the Cato Institute Center for Trade Policy Studies, where he led a team of lawyers, economists, and political scientists conducting research on all manners of trade policy, on subjects spanning from free trade agreements to international investment treaties, trade laws to customs procedures, digital trade to the manufacturing economy. He's written dozens of policy papers, given congressional testimony, and submitted statements and comments on proposed regulations to both federal and state agencies. He's also appeared in various media outlets. So with the two experts here, they have a wealth of information, and we're really excited about the debate today. The structure of today's conversation will be a few opening remarks from the two panelists. I will pose a couple of questions to get the conversation going, and then I'll turn to all of you for your input to have a further discussion on trade. So with that, I'll start with Lori. Ladies first.
Okay. Thank you very much, and appreciate C.J. Mahoney for organizing this panel. Very important topic. I want to start out just with this notion that we've all heard of a worker-centric trade policy, and what is that, and is that dramatically different? And I guess in the criticisms that focus has got, what do you mean we should be focusing on some particular outcome and interest? It sort of buries the part that's been silent, which we've had a trade policy up until the last 5-6 years that also had a centricity to it. It just wasn't spoken of. And that was, it was, if you will, corporate-centric, a large corporate-centric trade policy that also had various values embedded. A lot of it was branded as efficiency, but in fact, there are all kinds of contradictions in the existing trade agreements. So we have intellectual property rules that are sort of the classic rent-seeking monopoly of a government license. We had investment rules that, you know, in various indisputable ways benefited foreign investors, including U.S. entities when they were someplace else, relative to domestic investors. And there were lots of different embedded values that were in the previous 30 years model of trade. And starting with the previous administration, which didn't frame it as worker-centric, but American first, and with this administration, there certainly is a shift towards what are the goals and the outcomes with respect to different categories of interests and different sort of desired outcomes. And there's a big difference, I would say, between the previous administration and this administration in the intentionality of focusing on, if you will, workers, communities, public health, the environment as sort of an outcome, as a set of values, some of them almost elevated to the level of sort of basic rights, sort of elevated as an inalienable right that should be transmitted through commercial rules, as compared to, I would say, there was sort of more of a frame that would be industrial mercantilism related to national security and other goals with respect to the Trump administration. But either way, the point was to think about what are the outcomes we want, who are the parties, and it's a different set of parties than have been the tradition. And I think what's very interesting about the branding of worker-centric is to basically call out the part that's been silent, the part that's been quiet, but that's always been there, which is to identify that, there isn't down from Mount Sinai, like the Ten Commandments, a thing called free trade agreement, but rather it's a set of choices and priorities and calling out which ones right now should be the focus is, I think, both an honest move and also an overdue shift, however you want to brand that, but to think more about what are the things we want from the agreements and from the trade policies as compared to thinking of it in a sort of a, I don't know, decoded ideology of somehow free trade, and we worship it without thinking about what actually the rules are that are bearing that brand. I think that the shift that we have seen in the last number of years is one that is not a fluke and probably in a certain way is overdue. I think it reflects the external reality of the outcomes of the previous agreements catching up with the sales jobs. And there have been cycles of that have happened that have typically resulted in political accountability. Some prominent members of Congress or some politician has ended up, or in the case of the Canadian government after NAFTA, the entire political party has ended up being held accountable for an outcome and ends up basically being thrown out of favor, and then the cycle continues. But what's happened this time is enough people, disparate people around the US, have had negative lived experiences to the point where would have been billions of dollars in PR and paid ads in favor of the old model are no longer sufficient to overcome enough people's lived experience. And it's different for different people, but certainly what the academic literature reports as the outcomes of China, the China shock, and how that has affected communities, not just the individual workers, but when the companies go and the tax base goes, the entire community, the region, the expectations, the health, the well-being in disparate parts of the country, which are places you wouldn't necessarily even expect. It's not the Rust Belt, but if you look at some of the trade adjustment assistance data, some of the most dense areas of trade-related job loss and the places you can track through the commerce data, the loss of facilities, 70,000 facilities since the manufacturing facilities since the early 1990s. It's Texas, it's New York, it's California. It's like the places you don't expect it in the sort of myth of who the winners and losers are. And I think that what has finally been the reason I don't actually see the pendulum swinging back the whole way again, ironically, is COVID. So there were already other shifts. The national security establishment had started to see deindustrialization and our trade model as a threat to security, as a threat to basically military infrastructure. That was a pretty dramatic shift that started before COVID. The partisan blending of voters more by education level and the kind of work they do as compared to party identification, where you basically have had a shift where people who have been hurt by trade are looking for a party that is going to represent them on trade as compared to the party being the leading factor. But COVID, I think, as sort of a closing thought, seals the deal. Because for a time, I think for many people, the first time in their lives, they were confronted with how hyper-globalization, the model that has been implemented by today's trade agreements, affect them personally. And I think for a lot of people, it was shocking to be in the United States, given all of the hype about the nature of our country and our economy and our global economic model, and we could not make, and then we could not get basic things we needed to keep our families safe. And that's where the rubber hits the road, where you can't get your kid a mask, or you realize that, wait a minute, what do you mean we don't make any antibiotics anymore? When did that happen? So I think that there was a moment where people who aren't the people who lost the jobs, who were a much broader demographic, educationally, class-wise, started to realize maybe the pendulum's gone too far. And no one's calling for autarky. But what is that blend, and that sort of is, I think, what the discussion will be going forward, what is that blend of rebuilding domestic capacity that solves a bunch of different issues? By the way, is going to be increasingly important climate-wise to have regionalized production as compared to centralized production of heavy things and schlepping them from one location to every place else in the world if we start embedding carbon values. But as well, for various economic justice, domestic reasons, for resilience, for national security, what is the blend between rebuilding capacity domestically and diversifying our imports so that we're never in a situation where we're over-reliant on one or two countries for essential things, given in the future we can certainly predict there will be another pandemic, there will be climate crisis, there will be other disruptions, there will be war. So I think those are the questions going forward in a landscape that is pretty much permanently shifted. Thanks.
Thank you, Lori. You've raised several topics that I think we should spend some time unpacking. But before we do that, let's turn to Dan to offer any overarching comments about international trade, workers, and if we have sort of the balance right, are we sort of approaching it in the correct fashion? So I'll let you offer your opening remarks.
Sure. Thanks, Alexandra. And thank you, CJ, for the invitation. And Lori, it's good to be back with you again. I think since I've left Cato, some of my views have shifted to be more embracing of your own, but not entirely. So I think the program said that I'm with Cato, and I am no longer there. So you're going to get somewhat of a Cato-light perspective here, because my views have changed somewhat. The mission of the Cato Trade Center was, when I was there, and I assume it is still, to educate the public and policymakers about the benefits of free trade and the costs of protectionism. I left Cato a little over a year ago after 20 years there, and in the months before my departure, I wanted to kind of get a tally of what we'd gotten right, our successes, not just at Cato, but in trade policy overall. The year 2000 were pretty heady times. It was, the end of history. China was in the final stretch of its WTO accession protocol. It was pre-9/11. Things were a little bit different, and there was a lot of optimism among globalists, free traders, that things would continue in a liberalizing direction. But as I look back on what had happened, what had transpired in those 20 years, frankly, it was pretty depressing. Since 2000, there's not been much in the way of multilateral trade liberalization. In fact, since 1995, there really hasn't, since the establishment of the WTO, there really hasn't been any multilateral liberalization. There's been a failed multilateral trade round, the Doha round. It was the first failed round since the GATT was formed. And then after an early sign that the round was in trouble in 2003 in Cancun at the ministerial meeting where the negotiations were going on, the U.S. announced a policy of competitive liberalization. It was going to pursue bilateral agreements, regional agreements, I think as a way to show other WTO members that there were alternatives. And those bilateral deals, the United States during the Bush years, the G.W. Bush years, got new agreements with 16 countries over the course of 4 years. Most were small economies, excepting maybe Korea and Australia and perhaps Singapore and Chile, medium size. But most were pursued by the Bush administration, I think, for foreign policy reasons, not really economic integration reasons. Major U.S. trade partners responded to U.S. competitive liberalization by doing the same sort of thing. And many of our trade partners secured many more trade agreements than did the United States. And one major effort that could have and probably would have been a game changer, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was shot down by President Trump on his third day in office. Now, of course, there was a lot of domestic opposition to the TPP, so if it was put to a vote in the Congress, it's not exactly clear what would have happened, but Trump dropped that. And it also heralded in, I think, a darker era in trade policy. Trump came into office, he invoked Section 201 of the Trade Act of 1974 to impose safeguard duties on large residential washers, washing machines, parts of solar panels. He invoked Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962 to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum from virtually all over the world on the grounds that our reliance on imports was a threat to national security. And then he invoked Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 to investigate China's technology policies, forced technology transfer, IP theft, subsidization of industries, et cetera, and then went ahead after finding that it's problematic, that what they found was problematic, he imposed tariffs unilaterally. And I don't think the WTO has really recovered from that yet. One large regional agreement was renegotiated during the Trump years, and to my mind, it's more trade retarding than trade liberalizing. That's the USMCA, the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. It sort of cemented an unholy alliance of right-wing nationalist sentiment and left-wing labor sentiment. And the USMCA, I think, was celebrated as a big achievement, big bipartisan achievement, but it was an achievement in reducing, in my opinion, the appeal of North America as a platform to have North American supply chains, because it incentivized repatriation of supply chains. It incentivized more use of U.S. Labor and more use of U.S. value added. So it really didn't get us where we needed to go. I think it was a protectionist achievement. Today, I think President Biden's trade policy is largely indistinguishable from Trump's. And that's because Trump stole the Democratic Party's trade policy playbook and showed the Democrats how it works. And I think Biden has sort of taken it back and seems determined to keep it. I think politically, he doesn't have many options at the moment. I think America first and worker-centric trade policy means the same thing. Worker-centric, I'm afraid, is euphemistic. And so in a sense, America first is more honest because it is what it sounds like. But central to both are import barriers, buy local and local content requirements, domestic subsidies, stiff-arming multilateral rules, and indeed trade multilateralism. So we have to remember that when we do things on behalf of workers, that blue-collar workers and otherwise, their livelihoods depend on trade. They're not just in import-competing industries. They are in import-using industries and export-oriented industries. So when we impose tariffs and make it more difficult to import, and about half the value of U.S. imports are intermediate goods, we make it harder for a lot of U.S. workers. So I think it's a bit disingenuous to call it a worker-centric program. And also manufactured goods need export markets, so that's just another cost of it. Open trade is important to workers. Protectionism also may help some workers temporarily, but at the expense of others. So depressingly, there weren't a whole lot of accomplishments to celebrate after 20 years at Cato. I think Americans are less free to trade in 2021 or 2022 than they were in the year 2000. And it gets worse than that. In the month that I began working at Cato, which was October of 2000, Congress passed the Agricultural Appropriations Bill into law, and slipped into that bill was surreptitiously by Senator Robert Byrd from West Virginia was something that required duties collected by customs in trade remedies cases to be reallocated to the petitioners in these cases. Bill Clinton signed it into law as a lame duck in December and recommended that Congress do something about this because it would violate our WTO obligations. Congress never did anything about it, and lo and behold, several members brought the United States, brought a complaint in the WTO, and the dispute panel and the appellate body found that the United States had overstepped its bounds and recommended that it bring its practices into conformity with the agreement, and eventually it did. But that was the beginning of a slew of cases against the U.S. anti-dumping law at the WTO, and I think that was a sort of a cancer that spread among the U.S. petitioners bar and policymakers, including especially Bob Lighthizer. Administering trade remedy laws is much more a matter of domestic discretion and sovereignty, according to Ambassador Lighthizer. And so I think that is really what sparked the beginning of an effort to undermine the WTO. Then there were also these common myths about trade that were perpetuating, that we were hearing fairly regularly, that trade is an us versus them proposition. It's Team America against Team Europe or Team China or Team Mexico. We're hearing that the trade deficit is a bad thing and it undermines American jobs and the U.S. economy. It does not. Trade killed U.S. manufacturing. We always hear that. Well, U.S. manufacturing is doing pretty well. It's still number 2 in terms of value added around the world. There are just fewer workers, and manufacturing as a share of the economy is smaller than it was. Outsourcing is bad for the economy. We hear a lot about that. I think businesses should be allowed to pursue the production models however they wish, and they should be dealing with the risk of pandemics or geopolitics, or whatever it might be. When we have things like ISDS, I think that's a problem because ISDS subsidizes the decision to outsource because investment is risky, investing abroad is riskier still. ISDS socializes some of that risk. I think this is one area where Lori and I might agree. We also heard the myth that trade only benefits U.S. corporations. That's also not true. Trade is more beneficial to smaller companies, to lower income Americans. Tariffs are the most regressive taxes in the book. And then we had Trump's reaction to China. And that was something that was something that started brewing during the George W. Bush era. There were concerns about indigenous innovation policies in China. The U.S. was thinking about, we need to respond to this and do something. During the Obama administration, at the beginning of it, we had the Great Recession. A lot of U.S. policymakers woke up and said, what happened? China's doing so well, and here we are with high unemployment, and the economy's not growing. And what did they do right? What did we do wrong? And so under Obama, we sharpened the tools, the trade remedy rules. We started subjecting China to the CVD law. It had been the case that non-market economies were not subject to the CVD before. He brought the first successful China-specific safeguard case on tires against China. So this has been brewing for a long time. And but now we're at a point where our relationship, trade, when trade and China became synonymous, it became easier, I think, in Washington for policymakers to turn their backs on trade. So there's not a whole lot of bipartisanship in Washington, but there seems to be bipartisanship on this issue of China. And I think that the United States, this is one area where I depart from my colleagues at Cato. We should be doing something about it. We spent a lot of time defending the WTO and explaining that the rules-based system has been good for the United States, but there are some things that I think have to be taken into consideration here, and I think protecting national security is a very important objective of government. The battle for technological preeminence that we're having with China requires that we do something about it, and I was happy that the Trump administration and the Biden administration are following through on export controls and investment review, raising the bar for investment. We need to do these kinds of things. A lot of my colleagues in the pro-trade community point out, oh, well, there are huge costs to doing that. We're going to make it harder for U.S. semiconductor producers to sell in China. Well, yeah, that's a cost, but you have to also look at the benefits. We need to have a net benefit analysis here. So anyway, I prepared more remarks, but I realize I've gone on for too long. So I'll stop there and see what happens.
I know you're passionate about these issues as much as we are. So I think the length of your remarks showcase the passion for it.
Thanks.
I wanted to probe a little bit on, both of you raised the notion of corporate interest in our trade policy. Before the Trump election, there was this sort of the sense that trade is not working for the average person, that what is trade doing for Main Street? And I wanted to see if both of you can sort of talk about how you view the balance in our trade agreements and our trade policies between corporate interest and those, as you call it, the workers or the manufacturers or the blue-collar workers. There seemed to be the sense for quite some time that the benefits aren't flowing to the people. They're flowing to sort of the corporate interest and corporations, but not the people. And I want to sort of get your take on that premise, and if you see sort of those concerns as valid, and if they are valid, how do you change the perception of the average American to think that trade is in their best interest and is good? Maybe Lori, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Well, I think starting with the second part, how you change the perception is you change the rules so that actually the outcomes are more evenly beneficial to broader categories of people. And the data is pretty compelling about sort of the imbalance in the beneficiaries versus the losing parties under the 30 years of the sort of NAFTA WTO model of rules, and I can summarize some of that, but I think that in a way it's very predictable. And one of the very first things that in 1990, when I started working on these issues and was in the litigation group of Public Citizen, before there even was a Global Trade Watch at Public Citizen, which is where I was for many years, we were doing a Federal Advisory Committee Act lawsuit about the trade advisory committees because they were so disproportionately corporate. And in fact, at that point, there was really no one representing, to the extent there was any diversity, it was that there were some state officials and there were some unions, and none of the other potential interests were represented. And so we've had an advisory committee system and a trade agenda that sort of reflected the old days of when trade really was about sort of things you could drop on your foot, and the border taxes, the tariffs, and the quotas around those things, when you had really a much more limited scope. So the trade advisory system came from the '74 Trade Act, and that was really, those are rules about trade. When we started exploding the boundaries in the context largely of the Uruguay round, but the US-Canada agreement to some degree in NAFTA, where we suddenly have the service sector issues and intellectual property issues and a whole array of issues that implicate health groups and environmental groups and consumer groups and a much broader set of interests. The advisory committees didn't come in line with that as far as the representation, and so you've had rules with a really lopsided input, and then the outcomes as a result reflect. So you need a balance, for instance, with respect to the intellectual property issues, where you want to have an ability for people who create new ideas to have the ability to monetize that, to be able to support their next inventions. But the balance of putting that in a trade agreement, number one, and conditioning market access and honest-to-God trade on compliance with this other body of law, and then given you have diverse parties in a trade agreement at different levels of development, you have the standard that is the highest developed country standard as the standard of what everyone ought to do, and not even taking into consideration that like the U.S. was knocking off Europe before the U.S. was wealthy. That was part of our development path. So you have a sort of very lopsided set of rules reflecting one set of interests, and then so the outcomes are not shocking. That it's the theory of macroeconomic theory of trade that you distribute, to use the word, you distribute towards capital and away from labor in a dynamic that follows that pattern. And you can see it in any number of different factors, not the least of which is just practically the incentives around investment, which, you pointed out was incentivizing the offshoring of investment in manufacturing particularly, which is, where the 64% of American workers who don't have a college degree had a chance to have a decent middle-class living. And I think just to loop the whole thing back around, where it's gotten political and where it is, what will be necessary to change the perception, is when the lived experience changes, I think it had hit enough people in enough communities without having to know a damn thing about the theory of macroeconomics trade or what ISDS was, that they were getting screwed under a set of international rules that some of them thought were inevitable, but over time, seeing different versions of it, more and more people have realized, this did not come down from Mount Sinai. This was not sort of deigned to be. This is just one version of the rules, and it's not doing a good job for me.
Thanks, Lori. Dan, I think you probably have a slightly different perspective, so please.
Yeah, I would agree that I think corporations have greater access to trade policymaking, and they probably have better access to all sorts of policymaking, and I think the trade advisory system helps to mitigate that imbalance. But I would disagree that the average American hasn't benefited from trade. Consumers have benefited tremendously from trade. Over the past 30 years, we've had revolutions in communications, transportation, political changes in China, the end of the Soviet Union, all sorts of developments that made it easier for Americans to access the global economy and its wares. Individually, we can't call up somebody in Indonesia and exchange with them, but we have retailers who do that kind of thing for us. But I would say that corporations, maybe there's an adverse impact on workers to some extent, but the problem is the way we see this, the way politicians talk about it, is we see the shuttered factory or the rusty gate with a lock around it, and we see the blighted town adjacent to the factory, and we say, well, look what's happened. But what we don't see is, because we've opened ourselves up to clothing from abroad or textiles from abroad, Americans now have more resources. The divorced mother of two can, feed and clothe her children more. She'll have more for savings. More Americans will have resources for savings, which are used around the country. And all of a sudden, a semiconductor plant has access to resources to be erected in Arizona. President Obama and President Trump both sort of made this similar comment that who cares if you have a cheaper T-shirt if your neighbor's out of a job? But to me, that misses the point of trade. That's not, the point of trade is not to have cheaper products, it's to have more resources freed up. So those cheaper T-shirts enable that semiconductor fab to open up in Arizona.
No, I appreciate that perspective. Can I just probe a little bit on your intervention or your response? The blighted community or that shuttered factory, what do you tell that community who's sort of having that negative impact from the trade that's gone on or offshore or whatnot? In your estimation, what should be the response of that politician or of the representative of that group to respond to the concerns that community has?
Yeah. Well, what I have said in the past, and I would still say this, is that you have to have good policies, and you have to have policies that are going to attract other forms of investment. There's a lot of competition for domestic and foreign investment, and that tends to flow to places where the returns are going to be good. So, you see foreign direct investment on a per capita basis in the United States in southern states, South Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama. There's the right-to-work states, for example. And I'm not saying that every state should adopt that particular policy, but policies do matter. But I'd also say this, and this is where I've changed a little bit over the years, and that is, this is real life, all right? This isn't just textbooks. And I think people have, the United States wasn't exactly prepared for globalization, right? We didn't have the institutions set up the way the Europeans do, for example. I don't know if you guys have read President Greg Schaefer's recent book. It's an excellent book, and he attributes U.S. use of trade remedies to our absence of social safety nets. And whereas the Europeans have a more robust social safety net, and they're less, they're more inclined to defend the WTO and try to make sure that it moves forward. So we should have done a better job, and I think we can focus on that. But the purpose of trade is to grow the pie. And I think when you put in trade agreements and when you require things that limit trade's expansion in a trade agreement, you're making a mistake. That's the wrong order. You grow the pie, and then you have the social policies that make sure that bounty is properly distributed.
Okay.
Yes.
Back in for 1 second.
Yes.
If people wonder why I was rudely Googling, apologies. I was trying to get the right name of the paper because, yes, for sure, the gains of trade liberalization should be on the import side. You can look at it either as freeing up capital, or you can look at everyone benefits because it's less expensive stuff. So we net out positive if we have less expenses and we are earning the same amount. And the sort of loss is on the side of the individual or individuals, workers, and or the companies that are going to be hurt by import competition. But theoretically, everyone gains on the import side, certain people lose, and it nets out positive. And I want to flag for everyone the academic paper that showed the point at which, for the US, that was no longer true. And brace yourselves, it comes from Professor Samuelson, the grandfather himself of macroeconomic trade theory. If you all are advanced economists, you can follow the math. The narrative part is understandable to civilians, where Ricardo and Mill rebut and confirm arguments from mainstream economists regarding globalization. And he basically does the math using his own Nobel Prize-winning model that shows that because we are now offshoring jobs in higher wage categories, and the income losses are piling up in broader sectors, and he particularly in this paper, which was 2004, hones in on service sector professional offshoring. So medical diagnostics, statisticians in the insurance industry, computer programming and related very educated professions. Because the actual income losses with respect to the outsourcing of investment were going up, they actually beat the losses. The loss side in liberalization started to beat the gain side in less expensive stuff. And then that, if you want to see updated data where you actually take his model and plug in data over time, the Center for Economic Policy and Research has run those numbers about every 3 years since 2004. So on CEPR's website, you can see the number. And the one that sticks in my head is from 2017, which was per worker, it was a $1,600 net loss in the loss distributed over the economy of income relative to the gains of the lower priced goods. There were still gains, it's just they were wiped out by the income losses because of the value level of the kind of outsourcing.
Thanks, Lori. Both of you talked in your opening remarks about China. You mentioned sort of the China shock. You mentioned sort of Dan, you mentioned the importance of looking at other types of policies to respond to sort of the China challenge. I wanted to get your take on how the U.S. should engage with trading partners that have different economic systems. And is there an ability to reconcile a market economy with non-market economy practices in trade policy? And how do you reconcile those two systems? And can we reconcile those two systems to elevate some of the values that I think both of you have sort of espoused in your opening remarks?
Well, just to use an example, one problem that we have had with China, and by the way, I've been a strong advocate for U.S.-China engagement for decades, and recently I've kind of had some concerns about the security dimension. But steel overproduction in China has created all sorts of externalities, and including changes to the U.S. trade remedies law to deal with it. Something called particular market situation has been used in all sorts of unrelated sort of steel products. We're not in a position to tell China what its economic model should be, its system should be, but if it generates externalities that adversely impact us, and other countries, the same way, that needs to be mitigated. They need to internalize these costs that their policies generate. To me, having limiting tariffs and limiting interventions helps, but it doesn't help if the world has changed in such a dramatic way that practices that you can undertake with government bodies to secure advantages aren't disciplined. And I think there's a lot of that going on in China. So, a lot of us say, well, the United States didn't bring enough cases against China in the WTO. And I think a lot of their behavior is actually calculated to be just outside of the scope of these rules. So that's why I'm concerned about the WTO ever getting its legs back under itself. I mean, two countries, the two biggest members, have already demonstrated that they're going to do whatever they think is in their own interest. So it's a tough question for sure.
Lori, and then we'll pivot to some questions from the audience.
I think it's possible in theory.
Okay.
If parties decide to agree to a certain set of rules, and the rules have thought through the ways in which the parties may or may not try to weasel around the rules in a sufficient way, and then those rules are enforced. And I will underscore, and then those rules are enforced. Because if parties want to come up with a common set of rules, and they can, and they agree not by coercion to those rules, so it's not sort of the U.S. telling XYZ country what to do, but the countries actually agree. They decide as a sovereign there's a benefit to it, and then those rules are followed. You theoretically have countries that have certainly differences. I don't know if you can go as far as market economy, non-market economy. I think an experiment that isn't the full experiment is going to be the USMCA, where you have had a very different kind of Mexican economy. I'm not putting them in the same camp as China with respect to the things that are different, but there have been some very different practices there that are not sort of market-based and also are just different. And so I think we have a test case with the rapid response mechanism that CJ had a big role in helping negotiate and put in place, where you actually have some particular rules with respect to labor markets and the rights of workers and the balance and what that could signal to wage levels. And you actually have it enforceable. And there are all kinds of, unknowables about whether it will work, with no disrespect to the author, but you can create something genius and then there are things that just happen. So we've got a test case to see if we can actually see some kind of a convergence and operation under those rules. And it's an exciting thing, and there have been some cases that have shown that it can work, and there have been some indications that there may be ways around the intentions of those rules, and we're going to see. With respect to China specifically, I think that to the extent you have a powerful other entity that does not just have sort of a different goal with respect to trade, but a different goal much more broadly with respect to governance, worldviews. The tools of trade and commerce are in support of a broader agenda. And it makes the cost of changing what the commercial rules are sort of fundamentally disruptive of the bigger national project. I think it's going to be very hard to have agreement on rules because the goals are very different. And I think that in those instances, I have come to think that we actually probably will need to have more domestic defensive measures. So I think I was someone who maybe in retrospect was more naive about what you could do if you got the rules right and you enforce them. And China sort of makes the case study of either ways around the rules that will be found under any circumstance possible because the fundamental mission of the government is contrary to what the rules are about, and or they'll just be non-compliance. And under those circumstances, then I think we do need more of a balance for what we do domestically with, be it the problem with the AD/CVD laws is the horses out of the barn down the highway has been run over by a truck by the time you actually get the damages. So you have a lot of loss before you can actually do anything about it. So what are the other mechanisms? And I think, USTR Tai is spot on when she's talking about how we update the toolkit. And I'm not trying to put words in her mouth that she's thinking about this, but when she said that the first time, I thought, what are going to be our domestic defensive measures when the rules just are not going to be followed, and the current laws that we have to deal with that are such that there's going to be enormous damage before you can do anything about it.
No, thank you for that. We have a question from the audience that I want to sort of weave into the discussion, and it's focusing on national security policies and whether or not some of the national security strategies that are put in place related to commodity energy trade, if you can use some of those same national security strategies when it comes to energy trade to the manufacturing trade, and if there are sort of parallels that you see in the way that the government responds to energy issues, and can that also be translated into response to some of our manufacturing challenges? That's sort of the question from the audience. Yeah, it's a big one, yeah.
Yeah, that's a tough one. I'm not, so the premise is that we're doing things in the energy sector that we could use, tools that we could use in the manufacturing sector?
The question is, yes.
What are those policies?
Maybe it's focusing on some sort of controls that we have in place, trying to deal with critical minerals, maybe other types of sort of commodity and energy-related responses. Maybe not.
Look, I think the priority of any government is to protect national security. But the problem with that is that the definition's creeping, right? It becomes more expansive. So if we want to do anything, like, we have a national security issue, I think, with China. And the way I've heard this put to me is, can't we just cordon off the technology sector and treat that with the gloves necessary for national security treatment, and then have a normal trade relationship elsewhere? I don't think that's possible because I think once you are in a competitive situation, you are going to be trying to undermine one another. And one of the points we like to make when we're advocating for trade or free trade is that trade is mutually beneficial. It's a win-win. It's not a zero-sum. I think the kind of trade policy that we are going to be flirting with respect to China is a negative-sum policy, where the United States may take actions that aren't job-creating and economy expanding for the United States, but it's worse for China or worse for somebody else. And I think that we may be headed in this direction, particularly as we splinter off into competing trading blocks. And who knows, how fast this is going to happen. A lot of it depends on the war in Ukraine and China's tacit support for it, if not explicit, and because that's national security right off the bat.
That actually raises another question. You mentioned the importance of you mentioned the WTO, and what role do you think the U.S. has, or the WTO as an institution has, as it relates to members of that institution who are not following the rules? And so you have China, an example that we see play out time and time again within the enforcement and dispute settlement side. But now we have sort of the debate happening in Geneva on Russia and Ukraine. And what do you do about Russia's membership related to their aggression in Ukraine? How do you, in your estimation, what role do you think the WTO has in dealing with member states who are not playing by the rules, both in a very pointed way or something much broader as it relates to sort of Russia's involvement in Ukraine?
I don't, the WTO is a member-driven organization, right? And it doesn't really have authority to do anything. So things have to be initiated by members. And the whole question of whether Russia can be expelled from the WTO, I don't know whether that's even a possibility. I see other WTO experts here. Jennifer, I'm not sure. I'm not sure how that plays out. But you know, what's beneficial about the multilateral system is, and which we deprived ourselves of in dealing with China, is that you can bring leverage by having many more members, many more countries involved in trying to discipline another member's behavior. So I don't know whether anything has happened in the WTO with respect to Russia. I know the U.S. is revoked normal trade relations status. But even in this case, I mean, I'm not sure what the benefit is at the moment.
Lori, do you want to weigh in?
On the commodity energy trade stuff, I also am not very familiar with what the specific rules are, but I'm suspecting I get the gist of it, and actually is not different from a slightly heretical idea I've been kicking around in my head with respect to what we would think of as critical supply chains. And it could be critical supply chains with respect to national security. It could be critical supply chains with respect to infrastructure, physical infrastructure, communications infrastructure, medicines. I mean, it's a slippery slope what you define as critical, but this is the heretical idea, which is something a little bit like the multi-fiber arrangement concept of how do you figure out how to actually have really distributed production of essential things. And again, it's not like we should make everything here, but that different competing blocks of production are needed, because we've learned the hard way. It could have been the U.S. If we were the one that was the one place where X was made and the whole world relied on it, and for whatever reason we got knocked out of capacity in the way that we've seen with COVID and China being a center of so many supply chains. And it's not even sort of a nationalistic protectionist, it's much more a redundancy resilience concern, because we saw, I think a lot about the multi-fiber arrangement, because we saw a situation where when a distributed managed trade system was taken down, even though tariffs stayed in place, in short order, the Caribbean, Central America, South America, a lot of the rest of Asia, production really got centralized a lot in China, Vietnam, India, a handful of places. And there were other issues like scale, et cetera. But if you think about practically how you would create some intentional redundancy for the sake of supply chain security, you may actually have to, I know everyone's like going to keel out of their chairs and chuck stuff at me, but you may have to actually do some intentional distributed regionalization. And the mechanisms that are in energy trade, I know, part of it just like we will not trade in these goods, or we will make sure that we have a supply of that. It's a similar logic of basically thinking about the goal and then thinking about how you manage the supply. And so, I'm not sure exactly what that mechanism is, but when I think back about the multi-fiber arrangement and how it worked actually as a development tool, and how it distributed investment for starting of industrialization in a lot of countries, that then got flattened despite, the potential tariff barriers, I think it's an interesting lesson as we're trying to think about supply chain resilience, about, what worked in that system, what didn't work, but how are we going to, short of just using, individual AD/CVD tariffs, which may or may not work, as we saw with the results of some very high tariffs in that sector, but when the MFA went away, there was really concentration. So, and just on the WTO question, so I think the WTO in a lot of ways, the rules of the WTO are in no way in alignment with the realities we're facing right now on a whole set of issues. And the very fact that the question is, how would you throw a country out? The fact everyone's stumped on that sort of gets to the thinking of the time of the WTO, which was sort of the end of history period, which is there's going to be kumbaya, this neoliberal agenda, we all agree, here are the rules. There will not need to be these kind of questions raised about what happens when a member country invades another one. And I think that the likely sort of way this plays out is it could derail yet another WTO ministerial, because it is the case that there are a lot of questions about how you literally chuck out a member. But there is no question that you've got a lot of countries who right now, Dan, are basically unwilling to, every session of negotiation starts out with a speech by the US or the EU or someone else about how they won't be in the room with Russia. And then sometimes those negotiations just end. And there's a lot of consternation about how you could possibly sit in a room and have a negotiation with a country that's in the midst of bombing and murdering people.
Thank you. We are almost at the hour. I'll ask one more question from the audience, and then we'll conclude. There's a question focusing on the EU, and I think that would be really useful for us to delve into. You're both familiar with the China investment agreement that was sort of signed between China and the EU. The question from the audience is, how much should we take the CETA as a distancing measure from the EU, for the EU, away from a united transatlantic policy? So what role does sort of the CETA play in our policy with the EU, and should it play a role? Maybe Dan?
Sure. I mean, I think it plays a role because, well, let's go back to Tiananmen Square. The first Bush administration, I think, was trying to figure out what to do after Tiananmen. And there was a contingent within the White House advocating that we withdraw and not engage with China anymore. And one of the biggest concerns there was that, well, if we do that, we're going to be ceding business opportunities to the Europeans. And that may have factored into why we chose to go a different route. I think the CETA is a problem because in order to confront China or to compel China to behave more in a manner that is consistent with our expectations, the United States and Europe need to stand shoulder to shoulder. Mm-hmm. CETA drives a wedge between the U.S. and Europe, as does the Phase 1 trade agreement that the United States and China struck. So I was hoping that the Biden administration would have ditched Phase 1, the first month of the administration. And that would have been a salute to multilateralism and to comedy with the Europeans. So, at this stage, I think it's better to work on the transatlantic relationship and to discourage the Europeans from pursuing that, and likewise for the U.S. to get out of the Phase 1 deal.
Thank you.
So I think the complications that have CETA languishing are, to some degree, also part of the answer of what's going to happen, how it affects the U.S. and the EU relationship. And I think it's a crossroads because, and this actually loops back towards what Dan said about worker-centric trade policy being the same as America First. And I dispute that, actually, deeply. And it's a little bit of the same, the thing that they have in common is they both are ways of looking at what the outcome should be and being mission-oriented and then going around backwards. But there's a difference in the perception of the rules, and it's a little bit about the difference that may or may not be why the US and the EU have a commonality that can go forward, and China's outside of that. And that is, the worker-centric view is a more internationalist view, which is there are certain basic rights that need to be elevated in commercial actions. And some of this is stuff I know that some of the folks in the Trump administration thought was, totally woo-woo silly. But the notion of some of the international treaty rights, be they multilateral environmental agreements, be they the ILO standards, which the Trump folks did put into a trade agreement, but some of the UN charter rights as well. And the notion of there are sort of universal rights that should be the basis of commercial activity that prioritize health and the empowerment of workers to fight for better treatment, et cetera. And that is an internationalist view that I think is more at the root of, say, the Treaty of Rome and the Maastricht Treaty and sort of a European vision. Now, whether or not that's what those treaties actually do or what is at the basis of the EU is a whole different question. But sort of ideologically, it seems that that sort of way of thinking of individual rights that are absolute versus a Chinese government approach that is much more a less focused on the individual and certainly less focused on rights perspective that gets to a difference between the US and China and a difference between Europe and China that a little bit is what's playing out in all the difficulties on the final few inches of whether or not that investment agreement ever actually materializes. So I think that I don't think it's a dooming thing, but I think it's a crossroads moment, that both that CETA is jammed and the US and EU are trying to figure out if there is room and commonality.
Well, thank you for that. I want to thank both of you for your perspectives. I think we can tell that there's a lot of commonality, but there are some important differences in your approaches to trade, and we thank you for your contribution today to the discussion on trade, international law, and workers, and are we getting it right? So with that, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Reminder, if you need CLE